Good evening, everybody. This is the Matt Kwazaborski Show calling you live and direct from Atlantic City, New Jersey. We're on the eve of the annual air show here in Atlantic City. And tonight's show, where I usually riff about Philadelphia sports with my other partner, John Mathers, I am broadcasting with a great sense of sadness, tragedy, devastation. And that is nothing compared to what's happening in the country of Afghanistan. And I'm very honored and humbled to be joined by the great Dr. Ibrahim Al-Marashi of California State San Marcos. He is a professor of conflict management, of history, Middle East history, of all things related to history and conflict management. I first met Ibrahim in 2014, teaching in the Prague program. He was our conflict management professor when I was with the Fund for American Studies, the European Institute's director. And we worked together in, 6 TFAS Prague or APIS institutes, 3 EJIs, and then 2, and I dragged you to Ukraine in summers of 2016 and 2017. And first of all, Doctor, thank you for joining me tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, as we talked to a little bit earlier before the show, the last time that we worked together in Prague was 2019, and we had 3 students from Afghanistan there, 3 or 4, I believe 3. And I've personally been in touch with them. Obviously not going to release their names. 2 are in Kabul, and 1 is outside the country, as he's been sort of living inside and outside Afghanistan. And the 2 students in Kabul, or former students, say, please pray for us. We want to try to get out. We're not sure how that's going to happen, but just keep praying for us as well. And before we get into the full interview, I just want to welcome my loyal listeners. I want to thank Al Gore for inventing the internet. I want to thank Spreaker Radio for hosting the platform. And like I said, just thanking my loyal listeners who do turn in when I do finally have these podcasts. It's the 3rd one I've had this month or within the last month. So that's a good start for me to get back into the swing of things. And just really humbled that you're here to talk to us tonight a little bit. And before we get started into some of my questions, I do want to point out you were published today in AlJazeera.com, and you had a very interesting title. It was The Collapse of the Afghan Military. We've seen this movie before, and I think that's a very interesting article. And you touch on 3 headers. The first one is talking about the intervention in failed state building, placing the majority of the blame in your article in the United States, and how it's very similar to what happened in Iraq in 2014. And then you also talk about the pervasive corruption. And we also played taps in the beginning, and the reason I played taps is for the 245,000 Afghan civilians who have lost their lives in the last 20 years. Over 69,000 Afghan security forces military personnel have lost their lives in the last 20 years. Over 20,000 Americans were injured, and over about 2,300 Americans were killed. And my thoughts and prayers go out to all of their family. And I know in this day and age, thoughts and prayers is not a great thing to say, but, what else can you really do of what happened here with Afghanistan? And again, I appreciate you, Doctor, coming on. People can read your articles. They can look at your bios. You're with California State Marcos University. But tell the listeners out there that may not know about your background and where you were born and how you got to where you are before we go into more of the meat and bones of the interview.
So I was born in Baltimore, Maryland, but my family is they're originally from Iraq. Now, it just so happens well before Afghanistan was on everyone's radar, so to speak. I was interested in Afghanistan in the 1990s when the Taliban first came to power. I was worried back then. And at that time, I was working in Washington, D.C., and really none of the think tanks, none of the policymakers, not even people in academia, Afghanistan was a forgotten country. I would have never imagined that where I come from, Iraq and Afghanistan, would be both kind of come together in this surreal conflation in the first decade of the 21st century, where America was, spent one of its second longest wars and its longest wars in both these countries. So it just so happened it was an accident, but by the 90s, I was already interested in both of these countries that would become, the subject of headlines for, more decades now. That's my story.
That's a great story. And like, I think that one of the reasons that you're such a great professor and so loved is because you're from the region. You're not just someone sitting in a think tank office in Washington, New York, London, Paris, and just writing about it from really afar. You've from that region, your blood is from that region, your family's from that region, of the Gulf area into the Middle East, if you will. And what was it in the 1990s when the Taliban came to power in 96 that first caught your attention and that made you concerned?
It's pretty easy. I knew back then this was not a good situation. Okay, in terms of the Afghans who are living there, never mind the threat it would have for global security. So, growing up in California, the mosque I attended was people from Afghanistan and Iraq. So it was growing up, of course, I had this kind of interest because these were the people I interacted with in the mosque. So that's the personal, but the then there was the humanitarian. Because I knew these Afghans at the mosque, I knew how bad things were.
Mm-hmm.
In this civil war after the Soviets withdrew in 1989. Things were bad then, and then that chaos, the Taliban came. And for the particular community of Afghans that come to my mosque, the Taliban had a particular hatred towards them.
Mm-hmm.
And then Al-Qaeda, you add Al-Qaeda into that equation. It was maybe a year before 9/11 where I just had a bad or an ominous feeling something big was going to happen. And, it's weird to get these kind of geopolitical feelings in your gut. But in Croatia, so, the program TPAS, sorry, they had the program in Croatia due to COVID.
Right.
And even though I opened that class with, so imagine this would have been mid-July. I opened that class with a video of a young girl from Afghanistan who comes from this community that's targeted by the Taliban. They're known as the Hazaras. And in fact, two of the students we've had in TPAS were from the Hazara community. So I show a video of this young Hazara girl in mid-July. And basically her dream is to become a teacher. She's in first grade, I think, at the time of that when that video was made. And I showed that video because I had this sinking feeling. So this is literally just around a month ago, that things were going to go bad in Afghanistan. And maybe that video was produced, 7 years ago? I was thinking even that day in mid-July, where is this girl? Hopefully she's still alive. Mm-hmm. And if she is, I felt bad for her because the future she had 7 years ago is going to be deprived from her. That was me forecasting into the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So back in the 90s, how brutal the Taliban was, we know that they brought back a kind of Islam that factors back to what century? The Sharia law.
It's a type of Islam that's not really even native to Afghanistan. It's a combination of factors. On one level, it's an austere form of Islam practiced in Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. It's an older form of Islam that made its emergence in South Asia when the British were ruling. Okay, so on one level, let's call it a hybrid of the kind of very austere form of Islam practiced in Saudi Arabia that eventually evolved into the Islam practiced by ISIS, which I don't even call it the Islam practiced with ISIS, so let's put it in quotation marks. Right. It's that same form that emerged in Greater India when the British ruled. Okay. And it's also, though, a lot of it is not even Islam. It's a tribal code practiced by the Pashtuns, which is another ethnic group in Afghanistan, who predominantly form the Taliban. Mm-hmm. So it's a combination of very conservative tribal values with very antiquated religious values. It's culture and faith coming together in this regard. And then on another level, it's just an austere code that emerged in a country that's known war since 1979 and it's never stopped. And this is basically their way of saying the only way we can bring peace is to create to impose a very totalitarian form of rule.
Mm-hmm.
And they use religion to justify that totalitarianism.
Mm-hmm. So you're going to say, so basically the idea is that totalitarianism will come back to Afghanistan under the Taliban rule once they, get more control of the forces, especially within Kabul, but also on the outside of it. Both of you and I are historians. I just have a bachelor's degree in history. You have your PhD going way farther than I did in that. But we are both historians. And what I wanted to set the precedent here is not really play a blame game, because I don't think that's 100% fair for what's happening on any side of it. But how did the Taliban, what have they been doing in the last 20 years or maybe the last 15 years? And when did this sort of idea that the Taliban would come back really ramp up?
So, it's interesting you say the word blame game, because I was thinking about this. And for us historians, it's not a blame game. You see, there's this saying, hindsight is always 20/20.
Right.
Okay. And I never liked that phrase, because what they say is hindsight is what we historians do. And that is just always look at the past and look at, critical junctures where history could have gone a different way. And what are those critical junctures? That's what we study. So there is a blame game. And it's fine to call out blame, because history doesn't repeat itself. That's over-deterministic, but it does offer context.
Okay.
And so this is what I would say. The blame game was this. It was in 1989 when the Soviets withdrew. The U.S. lost all interest in Afghanistan. And that was the major difference. In other words, for the fraction of the cost that the United States spent in financing the Mujahideen,
mm-hmm.
who were fighting the Soviets, who, once the Soviets left, they turned against each other, creating a civil war.
Mm-hmm.
For a fraction of the cost of that military campaign, investing in, a mini Marshall Plan, if you will, call it that,
right.
in Afghanistan's reconstruction, could have prevented. Again, it's hindsight, it's hypothetical, it's counterfactual. But in my opinion, just from a humanitarian perspective, that's what needed to have been done. If we think of the cost of investing in Afghanistan back in 1989 and think what happened again since then, from 9/11 to a 20-year war,
yep.
and think of the cost of that,
yeah.
and then think of what it would have cost to help Afghanistan rebuild once the Soviets withdrew,
mm-hmm.
it would have been a minuscule fraction of the expenditure and the life and the death spent in the entire war on terror.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that summary. So you're basically saying that when the Soviets left, the U.S. had an opportunity there to invest into Afghanistan. They just lost the interest to do so. That's a very...
The U.S., the world community, international community, it's not just the U.S. Nobody really cared about Afghanistan back then. And
mm-hmm.
when I was saying in the 90s, no one was really caring about Afghanistan. Yes, this is, not just in Washington, internationally.
Yep.
There was Rwanda. Well, let's start with the breakup of the Soviet Union, Rwanda, Bosnia, the Yugoslav civil wars.
Yeah.
There was plenty of fighting in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
Even Somalia, I think, got more attention than what was happening in Afghanistan.
Yeah, absolutely. So when did the Taliban, or why did the Taliban all of a sudden have a massive resurgence in the last couple of years? And where is their funding coming from?
The Taliban are a drug cartel. Basically, most of Europe's opium is coming from Afghanistan.
Okay.
And we've all known how lucrative the drug trade is. That would have been lucrative enough, but the Taliban also get, in areas they administer, they're raising money there. And governments are giving them financing. Governments who might see that, the Taliban are pursuing their interests.
What can you name some of these other governments, or have a speculation?
Well, we can name them. Can we prove it though? That's the point. So it's an assumption. But let's just say which government has, never kind of even it's the greatest secret, is there? It's the Pakistani government.
Right.
If you see that the Taliban was created as a proxy force by Pakistan in the mid 90s to basically secure Afghanistan. And after 9/11, when the Taliban was on the run, they were able to establish themselves in the mountainous regions of Pakistan. It doesn't even have to be the Pakistani government. It's even just being able to have a base in Pakistan where you can raise funds, you see. It was enough for them to make a comeback. Add that to the drug trade, and then you have a perfect storm, so to speak. Now, there's the other reports. Was Russia really offering bounties, for American soldiers killed? Were they kind of giving financing to the Taliban? That is a very contentious issue, but that could be a revenue stream. But even if we just take away the foreign governments, because again, that's all speculative. What is not speculative is that the Taliban were a drug cartel,
right?
That were benefiting from the trafficking of drugs.
Right. But there's also has to be some part of where the Afghan government that was in power up until Sunday, they had to be also benefiting from a drug trade, no?
Oh, probably. That and probably a lot of other schemes where corruption was involved explains the mess that we are in, yes. Or the mess that we are in other words, in terms of from a kind of humanitarian perspective.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Can you go into a little bit of the evolution of the United States' supposed peace deal with the Taliban going back in administration?
So, with the Trump administration, the Taliban could say everything that the U.S. negotiators would have wanted to hear. In other words, we'll do this, we'll respect women, we will not be as harsh as we were. Okay. The minute they can say that, okay. But basically, then what does the U.S. do? It just says, okay, we trust you on your word. We are going to withdraw. And the minute you do that, you've wasted any kind of negotiating leverage. Okay. Because sure, now you've promised to this withdrawal. Of course, there is nothing in this agreement that really prevents the Taliban from reneging. Okay. Sure, the U.S. can impose sanctions, try to kind of ostracize it, make a pariah state. But we see, as long as there's the drug trade, probably Russia and China are going to work financially with the Taliban in terms of trade and deals. So in other words, we talk about those negotiations. Any of the kind of basically the U.S. played this negotiations very poorly in terms of more or less that the Taliban knew the U.S. wanted to get out, and basically any leverage or any cards that could have at least managed this process were not played at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. When the Trump administration sends Pompeo to negotiate with the Taliban only, the United States did not negotiate directly with the current Afghan government in power under President Ghani, or were they also part of it? So right then and there, they gave the Taliban a sense of credibility in terms of that's
very good.
The sense of like, we are going to recognize you because we think you're going to take over. So the Taliban must have been doing. I think it's a little bit different than just Trump's America's first policy. Let's get the hell out of Afghanistan. There had to be something going on within the country that either the Americans were tired of dealing with, or they saw the signs on the wall that the Taliban was going to have the capabilities to make a resurgence. Because in some ways, when you do that, I want to say, in a way, they're almost putting together another corrupt government, yes, in the Taliban, but also with this archaic belief in the way they see the world, the way they treat women and children and things like that, almost like putting ISIS within borders and keeping them there. And for some reason, while the Trump administration wanted to take a lot of credit for destroying ISIS and really putting them on the run, and they sort of did with the help of some others, then they kind of turn around and say, well, we don't mind if there is a very hard-lined Islamic way to rule the world as a ruling government, as long as you stay within your borders. Is that fair to say?
Realist approach of Trump. Well, remember, Trump wasn't about promoting human rights or kind of defending democracy abroad. The first trip he took abroad was to Saudi Arabia. When the Saudi journalist was killed in Istanbul, the Trump administration didn't want to go hard on Saudi Arabia. And a lot of how you're describing the Taliban is very similar to the archaic ways Saudi Arabia works. So, I mean, it is not surprising because, democracy promotion wasn't one of the central pillars of the Trump administration's foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I want to read you a quote or a Facebook post from a man named Volodymyr Dubovic, who is based out of Odessa, Ukraine. We would have been working with him if something could have worked. He's a professor at the International Relations of Odessa Mykonov National University. I met with his faculty at one time. We just weren't able to get together doing something. He put a couple quotes today on posts since then saying that, while he's pro-U.S., he can criticize and deserves the right to criticize. But he put something on his post August 15th. And here's Volodymyr's post, and it's a public post. I remember sitting in the room at the Wilson Center in Washington in 2016 and listening to then President of Afghanistan, Karzai. What struck me then was his explicit opportunism, lack of any principles, not even on a surface, not even for a show. The guy was a walking example of a corrupt politician with the only intention to milk America as much as he could. He was not even trying to pretend that he cared about anything else. I distinctly recall leaving the meeting with this feeling in quotes, oh my God, this is who the U.S. and its allies rely on there. Unsurprisingly, has crumbled like a house of cards now. How do you feel about what Volodymyr posted on his page the other day?
Oh, I mean, that's good. Because basically the way he was describing him, if you remember Iraq's leader when ISIS took power, you could, basically Vladimir's assessment, just replace Ashraf Ghani with the prime minister of Iraq at that time. And, it would have been interchangeable. Mm-hmm. Exactly. I mean, the weak leadership you had. And, because you could blame the U.S. all you want, but at the end of the day, and it was the same with the case of ISIS, when the executive and the system that they're at the helm at is rotten to the core. Okay. There's only then there's only so long you can stay, you realize,
Right.
Because, after Karzai was out, none of the other successive administrations were really any better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because almost like you're saying with, the U.S. back then, they go into Afghanistan, after 9/11, I think November of 2001, and the Taliban were gone felt like a moment. It's like, all right, we're in a history. So now they get into the nation-building mindset, but then it's almost like what Volodymyr is saying is that the United States back then would have relied on anyone. As long as you don't bring the Taliban back, we'll give you the money to build your nation. But yesterday, I think it was yesterday when President Biden's on there, said we weren't there to nation build. And I'm not sure he was accurate in that assessment. Like, he basically toed the line saying we wanted to go in there. We wanted to make sure that Al-Qaeda was on the run and to get Osama bin Laden, who was in Pakistan, by the way, when Obama's forces, the Navy SEALs, found him in 2011. What do you counter that Biden was wrong about the nation building and it was just a military operation that just so happened to last for 20 years?
So this is the thing. If you go into a country like Afghanistan or Iraq, you could quibble about what we were there for, make it an issue of semantics. But if you are the occupying power, you have an option. You can leave and just leave that place to chaos. and then just create the conditions in which Al-Qaeda could have come back to Afghanistan or the Taliban, or you are going to have to nation build. So you could go back in time and say, we weren't, we're not into this business. We never were. But the point is, in two cases, in 2001, 2003, Afghanistan and Iraq, you replace the system. Then by definition, you replace the government of a nation. It is your responsibility to fix what you broke.
Right. Yeah.
And it's really hard to do that. And I think that's where the Biden administration just found themselves. That, part of a huge problem that began as 2001. That it was just really the massive process of trying to build a nation like Afghanistan was they underestimated how hard it would be.
Yeah, no, I mean that's obviously clear now with the collapse of the country back to the Taliban rule, with that happening so quickly. The other thing too is I think was very surprising that I think it was as early as July 9th or 8th or 9th, Biden made public remarks saying there's no way, the Afghan, it's going to take a while for the Taliban to take it back, and then since then they just really ramped up the Taliban. And I was sharing some articles with you before that how the Taliban were, I think the agreement with Trump was that we will no longer target the American soldiers. And then they just went completely after the Afghanistan security forces, targeting Air Force pilots, because with the Air Force, they could have effectively, bombed the Taliban and stopped them from advancing. They attacked and murdered and executed 22 commandos or special forces. There's 21,000 commandos in all the Afghan army, but they murdered 22 of them when they said, almost similar to what Russia did to Ukraine in Ilyasovansk back in the war. Anyway, don't want to divert to that. My point being is that the morale was down. There's also reports about how the Afghan security forces, which could be army or the local police or the regional police, they haven't paid in 9 months. The Taliban was coming in and saying, basically, we'll pay you your salary if you give us your weapons. Then it just seemed like there's even reports that maybe there was just a complete collapse where they said, don't fight back. Like they don't want a civil war. None of you, we don't think we can win. And they just kind of, Biden put the onus on saying the Afghans didn't want to defend their country. But then I started with the statistic that 69,000 Afghan security forces have died, since 2001. So I guess the point being is, why was Biden under the impression that it would take months or even a year for the Taliban to come back and make those statements publicly? And the second question, and I think where he fully went wrong, was saying this is our pullout date of September 11th.
Yeah. Okay. And I think it's a good point that you mentioned. All the Afghans who died defending their nation. So it's not that the Afghans didn't want to defend their nation. It was the same with the Iraqis. You might want to defend your nation, but if you're not getting paid, then that's the problem is with the leadership, the generals, the civilian command. This is an important note that's worth bearing in mind. So why the mistake? It's this. The U.S. spent billions of dollars training an Afghan military. I think at the end of the day, they were hoping their investment would put up a fight. I think at the end of the day, at some point naively, they thought that at least their investment in terms of the Afghan military might at least defend Kabul and the non-Pashtun areas. And I think just like with the Iraqi army, it's a bit of wishful thinking. It literally was so similar in that you've invested so much in both of these militaries with the American weapons, American training. The assumption is if our military is the best in the world, surely the Afghan military is going to benefit. And we saw it's not about training. If your soldiers lack morale, if your civilian leadership is obviously corrupt. Is this worth? You want to defend your home and family, but do you want to defend this corrupt, rotten system?
Right. But why do you think? Do you think there's a failure in the American intelligence reports? Because I still think someone's got to bite the bullet on this. You know, in the American, the fact that Biden publicly said 6 weeks ago that it's going to take months, maybe a year, for the Taliban to come back, and it took 5 weeks. Like, where did that go wrong? And then you lead to this chaotic situation in Kabul where he has to send 7,000. I think he's sending 7,000 troops back in to like just secure the airport. Like, was there a failure somewhere? Like, why do you think it happened so fast?
Well, the failure is this. We have to ask ourselves, intelligence is collected by sources on the ground.
Right.
What kind of intelligence network did the U.S. have in Afghanistan? Kind of the ears to the ground. I assume it's almost non-existent.
Yeah,
given how quick the U.S. was trying to get out of there, right? Basically, this intelligence has to be collected by somebody, right? What kind of presence did the CIA have?
Right.
Or even military intelligence, for that matter. Because remember, it's not just the CIA. Every branch of the military has their own intelligence agency.
Right.
So there, I really have doubts about the human intelligence network that the U.S. had. How extensive was it? So in other words, because you're talking about acting upon the intelligence. I'm curious about how good was the intelligence that was collected. And I think that's what was, I'm assuming, but just kind of deductively, that must have been weak.
And do you think that the reason that it was weak was what Biden, I don't say inherited, that's not the right thing, but the people that he put in place just didn't have the capabilities to get the intelligence, or it was already pretty much that even when Biden's, going through the election, the turmoil of the elections this year, by the time Biden was inaugurated, that the Taliban were already pretty much ready to go, and they knew they could take advantage of a young administration, and someone like, what is his national security advisor is getting slammed? Jake, the Biden security advisor. I forget his name right now. It's Jake something, and he's all over the news. But maybe he just didn't have the capabilities to, work with an effective intelligence gathering situation. Jake Sullivan is his name.
So there's we go back to kind of the intelligence. It's this. Probably, I'm assuming a lot of the intelligence could have been gathered by higher Afghan military officers who wanted the military to seem strong. It's in their interest to do it.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, this was an intelligence fiasco. But they've happened in the past. 9/11 being a good one. There were maybe strands of intelligence warning of a potential attack. It was never put together in a cohesive way to kind of ring the alarm bells. So that's why you have this kind of centralized national intelligence committee that was created. We don't know. At this point, it's still too early. Where there's some because remember, the America's intelligence infrastructure is a hydra. Where there's some agencies reporting that there was this danger, where others not. That we will wait to hear. Was the NSA basically depending on only signals intelligence, would indicated that this wasn't a problem? Again, we don't know.
Okay.
As civilians, we don't know.
Yeah.
So, but like I said, it's okay. On one level, there's the intelligence. That's one part of the fiasco. But at the end of the day, let's go back in time as historians. Was it really the faulty intelligence that's really at fault here, or a poor peace deal that was negotiated without the Afghan government?
Yeah.
Because what we study in conflict management, remember in 1938, the Munich Agreement, that kind of more or less gave away Czechoslovakia to Nazi Germany.
Right.
Czechoslovakia wasn't even consulted in that agreement, right?
No.
They weren't part of that negotiation, and that led to World War II. Conflict management always says, who are the parties to the conflict? You always have to bring them on board if you're going to have some kind of conflict management.
Right.
That is a major failure in conflict management, not bringing in the Afghan government, because that more or less signaled to the Afghan military, we've had the rug pulled under us. We've been
Right.
sold, they sold us out, the
Right.
Americans, you see.
Right. So let's shift some focus a little bit further to your where your family's from in Iraq. We all know that Iraq was overrun by ISIS, but then ISIS is sort of on the run. What has the Iraqi military and political system survived that? Was it how did are they back in power? Just I'm kind of curious. I mean, I kind of know, but I want the audience to know what has happened since ISIS was pretty much forced out of their that region in Iraq. Like what's happened with the government, civil society, the military, just in a brief way.
Well, so the Iraqi army had to be rebuilt, but you notice there's a huge difference. America said we had to go in, right?
Yes, and for ISIS, yes.
Okay, for ISIS. But then what happened in the meantime? With that security vacuum, you had a emergence of a network of Shia militias
Mm-hmm.
that really became a parallel power to the army and became such a threat, at least from Trump's perspective, that the world almost went to World War III, as it was feared in the beginning of 2020 when Trump assassinated the head of one of those Shia militias as well as an Iranian general.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's happened, you see.
Mm-hmm.
So what you have in Iraq is kind of a parallel system of a network of Shia militias that coexists now alongside the Iraqi military, but a lot of similar problems with Afghanistan: corruption, the failure of governance, the failure to deliver services. We just don't hear about it in the news because it's always that way. Once ISIS was defeated, it was no longer headline news. But a lot of the problems plaguing Afghanistan exist in Iraq.
Right, exactly. But do they have a democratically elected government? Is it how many, is it the president prime minister situation there?
So, you have a democratic system in which the outcome is unknown,
Mm-hmm.
where you could have genuine upsets in the electoral process.
Mm-hmm.
So by those criteria,
Mm-hmm.
you have a democratic system. Do you have the viable, talented leaders to choose from?
Right.
That's what's lacking in Iraq.
Right. Exactly. So you have some more time left to talk about another 10, 15 minutes?
Of course.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. I do appreciate it. It's the Matt Kwazaborski Show, talking to my good friend and conflict management historian, professor of California State Marcos, Dr. Ibrahim Al-Marashi. We've worked together in Prague. We've worked together in Ukraine, and just stayed in touch since I moved back from Prague almost 2-3 years ago now. So very happy to maintain these relations. And again, thank you for coming on the show. You start looking at the pushback against democracy, or is this just sort of like anti-democratic forces now just, I'm going to say emerging, that doesn't make sense, or just pushing back with against democratic forces? Because when you go and look at the history of the world since World War II, you had the Americans were able to pretty much fund through the Marshall Plan and rebuild Western Europe. The EU gets created. Then the Iron Curtain comes down in '89. Soviet Union dissolves in 1991, almost to the day. Actually, I saw RFERL today. But now you sort of have countries that are on the periphery between the EU and Russia, being Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. And these countries, especially Ukraine, is now starting to show flashes of becoming a more open democracy. You have Moldova, which has a very pro-EU government for now. But then you have situation in Georgia and Belarus where the gains being made since 1989 are being completely thrown out. Georgia the other day signed a pact with the Belarusian security services that they will work together. And Belarus right now is in terms basically becoming a Russian, I don't say prize state, but almost like a real puppet state, almost becoming absorbed by Russia. So in a way, when you think of European history since World War II, this is the farthest the east. When you think about how far Ukraine has come, although ripe with corruption and also ripe with anti-democratic forces to keep that corruption in play, it is still very much developing. Moldova is trying to do the same. Georgia was a great success story from 2003 to 2012. But those sort of countries, I want to say, have had experiences with democracy in the past. When the United States decides to go into Iraq in 2003, which in my opinion was absolutely wrong, it was trying to get rid of a despotic leader, but I also think trying to build somehow a viable democratic nation bordering Iran and Saudi Arabia, almost splitting it in half, but also the oil becomes a situation. We go into Afghanistan in 2001, obviously to root out the Taliban, who, by the way, did not attack the United States, but were harboring al-Qaeda terrorists and Sunni terrorists who were targeting the United States, and that's how 9/11 happened. And then you have almost the emergence of ISIS. So what I think I'm trying to get back, like, has democracy hit that line in the world where it's like, we're being pushed back? Is it failing? Western values of freedom of the press, women's rights, human rights, children's rights. And it's also under attack here in the United States, and that's a whole nother different sort of conversation. But do you think in Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations we've hit that point and we can't go any further east?
So with Huntington, actually I would avoid Clash of Civilizations and go back to his early work on what needs to happen for democratization.
Okay, fair enough.
One of his classical works was kind of on how do democracies consolidate themselves. Now, I find a lot of his works on the consolidation of democracy. Of course, his criteria are problematic, but let's just use the consolidation of democracy. Mm-hmm. Basically, this is the problem, was simply if we use that framework, in each one of these cases you've seen, there's the consolidation of democracy never really happened. Now, in other words, what is implicit in that word consolidation of democracy? As a historian, that there are key junctures. History is contingent, or there were opportunities to be made. A certain election went one way, and that whether it's an election that chose Viktor Orban for Hungary, mm-hmm. and after that point, the fate of Hungary is sealed. When Boris Yeltsin chose Vladimir Putin, you could say in that decision, Russia's fate was sealed. Mm-hmm. That's what we're more or less seeing. It's perhaps let's use a historical analogy. If we look at the 30s, the 1930s.
Yep.
That was a time of authoritarianism rising, and that's just all I can say as a historian. That's just simply where we are. Mm-hmm. We entered the 2020s. We will see, is it a similar decade to the 1930s? Mm-hmm. Which, again, doesn't bode well, because, of course, we saw where the 1930s led to.
Right. Right.
But that's all I can say as a historian, because I'm not a political scientist. I mean, Huntington is a political scientist. I know his work. Mm. I know that this is an issue where he would call how the consolidation of democracies. And using that framework, I can say just very simply, some democracies did not consolidate. Mm. As a historian, when we see kind of a pattern, yes, have these patterns occurred in the past? Yes. Does that mean we're on the road to World War III? I hope not, because I keep on insisting history is not deterministic. It just gives us the context to better understand our present.
Okay, good. Thank you for that commentary. We're going to wrap it up soon. My friend Philip Kaczorowski over in Czech Republic, he is a young American football coach who's about 34 years old. So he was born slightly before the fall of the Iron Curtain. And you and I, or at least working in the jobs that we did together in Prague and Ukraine, we're always trying to push the idea of free markets, but also the idea of democracy, freedom, liberty, things like this that we always say Americans take for granted. And while democracy in the sense of like letting people choose their own fate, right? I always said democracy is just the most peaceful revolution that you can have. But Philip, who's a pro-U.S., pro-Western guy, young guy, like I said, we were talking about Afghanistan the other day, and he says to me in a message, he says, I still think the U.S. didn't realize that they didn't win the Cold War because of ideology, but because of economy. And that's why the transition for Eastern European countries at the time was so smooth, because everyone knew how rich people are behind the borders and how poor they are under communism. And also that's the reasons we have all those populists here, because it's not about people wanting to live under democracy and preach human rights. They just want to have a good income to be able to go for a vacation here and there and buy new things from time to time, kind of like live more economically in a free way. And that really like, I wouldn't want to say it caught me off guard, but it's true, a lot of ways after spending so much time over there and living there, and Czech Republic's one of the most democratic of all the nations from behind the Iron Curtain, probably the freest when it comes to democracy for now, compared to Poland, Hungary, and a little bit in Slovakia. I don't know, when you hear that quote, what kind of resonates with you when he says it wasn't really about ideology, it was about economy?
For something as complex as the end of the Cold War, he's right. That was absolutely part of it. But there was also a lot of other factors. Mm. And that's simply what we do as historians. We debate what are those factors. If you look at kind of the case of East Germany versus West Germany, where it was obvious what kind of, what was happening beyond the wall, you were so close to it. It was, what kind of life and opportunities your co-nationals enjoyed. Definitely, economics played a part in it. Absolutely.
Yeah. It was economy. And I think that's one of the things that I talked to a lot of Ukrainians during the Euromaidan. They said, Poland's right next door to us. They're in the same situation we were in 1991. Why are they doing so much better now? And that's just like from a common perspective. But anyway, what I'm trying to see is like, and probably a different discussion about where democracy is headed. And we also are getting a lot of illiberal democratic leaders now, or illiberal, or leaders who were elected democratically want to turn their countries into illiberals, such as Hungary. Poland's on the verge of that potentially, as is Turkey anyway. But we want to talk about Afghanistan, and I want to let you say some final thoughts on what you are concerned about. What is there anything positive? I don't think there's anything positive. Is there anything? Yeah, just if you can, just wrap up if you want to give us some final thoughts about what happened, the future of the Afghan people, really.
That it's unfortunate in my lifetime. The fall of Kabul, we have to remember. Most people remember this weekend. I remember when it fell in 1996. Mm-hmm. So that's my reflection. It's tragic because I can remember Kabul falling twice. Mm-hmm. Under the Taliban, and that this didn't need to have happened. If I think of the way the American military presence was maybe sold to the American public, mm-hmm. It was. I think the question was not whether we want to end forever wars, but let's say an American military contingent in Afghanistan. Think of how long American troops have been in Germany and Japan.
Right.
If it was sold to them as, is this the price to pay? A small contingent there to prevent the resurgence of the Taliban and a potential 9/11. I think the American public would have had a different vision of the mission there. Because that's the way it needs to have been sold to the American public. But really a minuscule military contingent was what was keeping the Taliban at bay from ruling over millions of Afghans
Right.
and sending their lives, particularly millions of women, and sending their lives backwards.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so that's what I think the mistake was. This is where this tragedy lies. I see a lot of analogies with Saigon 1975, and I think they're faulty analogies.
Mm-hmm.
Because really the Vietnam War was unwinnable.
Mm-hmm.
The North Vietnamese were fighting to unify their country.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they were a much more motivated army. In this case, really, what it would have took was just a minimal commitment, not just even from the U.S., from NATO,
Right.
to at least keep the Taliban at bay.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just short-sightedness that, okay, now nobody could have seen what would have happened when the Taliban took over in 1996, 9/11 happened. Who knows what's going to happen now? And that's always a scary moment, is the uncertainty that's now going to follow. Never mind just from a humanitarian perspective, how millions of Afghan lives are going to be affected.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as the United States exits out militarily, diplomatically, we'll have very little knowledge of what's going on the ground, or we have to rely on adversaries in a way to provide some sort of updates, which they're not going to be very forthcoming. But I think about what I've thought about the last couple of days is that for women's, people, the strides that women have made in just being productive members of society and holding positions as judges. I think there was an article today or a piece there was like 7 judges that their lives are probably mostly in danger just because they're women judges. Or female judges.
Afghan police women, there was a good number. They've been killed by the Taliban in the past. I assume nothing is going to be different. Civil society activists, women rights activists, advocates. Yeah, all of them are in danger.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not in danger of being locked up in prison and tortured, basically being killed in the streets. And there's obviously reports in the rural areas of the Taliban that they're already putting in this archaic view of Islam. But I think I'll go back to one of our 3 students, and that one of them 2 of them are in Kabul, and they both attended universities outside of Afghanistan. And I said, hey, how are you? What is the update? He said, well, the president of the university says he's going to do his very best to get as many of the current students out of Afghanistan and the alumni. And he's like, I really hope this happens. And today I was watching the news to where the Taliban have now controlled the road to the airport. They're letting any foreigners go through, including Americans, Brits, whatever. But they're not letting the Afghans go through because they want to keep them there, not to lose their talent. And my heart just breaks for our former students, who came to our programs, were active members they weren't just sitting there, doing nothing. They were very active members. My heart really goes out to just even those 3 people and their family. And of course, as a sort of reflection of what's going to happen in Afghanistan in the coming years or whatever. So that's what I've been really thinking about since I contacted you on Sunday, like those 3 people, and my heart really does go out to them and their families, and just like, anyway, I want to thank you, Dr. Al-Marashi, for joining me on this podcast. I really do appreciate it.
Well, thanks for organizing this and, just raising awareness.
Yeah, I hope that maybe we could maybe make this a regular thing.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, and see what we can do if we can get a certain time there. So I'm just going to play the taps again, close the podcast, but then if you could just stay online after I close the podcast for just a little brief recap, I would appreciate that.
Sounds good.
All right, here, unfortunately, to play this again. Again, we played the song Taps for the 245,000 Afghan civilians who have lost their lives in the last 20 years, which does not include the 69,000 Afghan security forces from a military perspective to local forces, to the 20,000 American soldiers who have been wounded, 2,300 have lost their lives, and to all their families. And plus, I did not include our Western NATO partners and other non-NATO members, countries such as Georgia and Ukraine, who send troops there that lost their lives in the last 20 years. So again, thanks for tuning in. This is the Matt Kwazaborski Show. I want to thank all of my loyal listeners. And I still will end it like I always end every podcast. Inspire the inspiration. Do not wait for the inspiration to inspire you. Thanks a lot, everybody.